The echoing gunshot made Daisy Valentino flinch as the crowd around her erupted in whispers. Standing in the middle of Willow Creek's dusty main street in 1873, she gripped the torn letter in her trembling hands while her former fiancé strutted away, leaving her reputation shattered in his wake. "Ruined," someone muttered, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "That Valentino girl is ruined forever." Daisy pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, fighting back tears as the news spread through the small Wyoming town like wildfire. The scandal was simple, but devastating. Her engagement to the banker's son had ended with public accusations of impropriety, though the truth was far different from what Thomas Hoffman claimed. "Let them talk," she whispered to herself, lifting her chin despite the weight of dozens of judgmental stares. At 22, she understood that a woman's reputation in the West was as valuable as gold and twice as difficult to mine. Now hers lay in tatters. The dusty street seemed to stretch endlessly before her as she forced herself to walk, one foot in front of the other, ignoring the whispers that followed. Her family's small farm lay 3 miles outside town, and the journey had never felt longer. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her step aside, pressing against the weathered boards of the general store. A tall figure on horseback slowed beside her, the magnificent chestnut stallion pawing at the ground impatiently. "Miss Valentino," came a deep voice she recognized immediately. "Might I offer you a ride home?" Jacob Ryder. The man's reputation preceded him across 3 territories: skilled rancher, former cavalry scout, and a man who kept to himself. His sprawling ranch bordered her family's modest farm, though their paths rarely crossed in town. "I'm quite capable of walking, Mr. Ryder," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He shifted in his saddle, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "I've no doubt of your capabilities, Miss Valentino. It's merely an offer from a neighbor, nothing more." Something in his tone made her look up. There was no pity in his eyes, only a quiet understanding that made her throat tighten. In that moment, she realized he had witnessed the entire confrontation. "Thank you," she finally said, accepting his outstretched hand. His grip was firm as he swung her effortlessly up behind him. "Hold tight," he instructed, and she hesitantly placed her hands at his waist, acutely aware of the solid warmth of him as the horse began to move. They rode in silence until the town's buildings gave way to open country. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling landscape, painting the grasslands in gold and amber. "People have short memories, Miss Valentino," Jacob finally said, his voice carrying easily back to her. "This will pass." "Not in Willow Creek," she replied bitterly. "They've already decided I'm ruined." He was quiet for a moment. "Then perhaps their opinions aren't worth your concern." "Easy for you to say. Men can weather scandal. Women become defined by it." The horse slowed as they approached the fork in the road, one path leading to the Valentino farm, the other continuing on toward Ryder Ranch. "The truth has a way of making itself known, given time," he said, guiding his horse toward her home. Daisy caught sight of her father working in the fields, his head lifting at the sound of approaching riders. Her mother would be inside, likely worried about her extended absence, and her younger sister, Emily, would be full of questions about why Daisy had returned on Jacob Ryder's horse. "Mr. Ryder," she said as they approached the modest farmhouse, "I would appreciate if you wouldn't mention what happened in town." He turned slightly, his profile strong against the setting sun. "It wasn't my business to begin with, Miss Valentino." As he helped her down from the horse, their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary. Up close, she could see the small scar that traced his jawline, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years squinting against the sun. "Thank you for the ride," she said, suddenly finding it difficult to meet his gaze. "Anytime, Miss Valentino." He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode away without another word, leaving Daisy standing in the yard with more questions than answers about the enigmatic neighbor she'd barely spoken to until today. Her mother appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Daisy? Was that Jacob Ryder?" "He offered me a ride home," Daisy said simply, brushing past her mother into the house before the questions could begin. That night, sleep eluded her. Daisy lay awake, replaying the humiliation in town, Thomas's cruel words, and the unexpected kindness of Jacob Ryder. Outside, a spring storm gathered, lightning illuminating her small bedroom in brief, brilliant flashes. The thunder that followed seemed to echo the turmoil in her heart. By morning, rain had transformed the landscape into a sea of mud. Daisy rose early, determined to lose herself in work rather than dwell on her shattered future. She had just finished feeding the chickens when she spotted a rider approaching through the downpour. Jacob Ryder dismounted in one fluid motion, leading his horse under the shelter of the barn's overhang. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat as he approached. "Mr. Ryder," she greeted him cautiously. "What brings you out in this weather?" "Your father," he replied, removing his hat. "I spoke with him at first light. He mentioned needing help with repairs to your barn roof before the worst of the spring storms." Confusion flickered across her face. "He didn't mention anything to me. Perhaps he didn't want to worry you." Jacob's eyes met hers steadily. "I've brought some extra lumber and tools. With your permission, I'd like to get started before the next downpour." Before she could respond, her father emerged from the barn, nodding and greeting to Jacob. "Right on time, Ryder. Appreciate you coming by." As the two men discussed the repairs, Daisy watched Jacob carefully. There was something deliberate in his actions, a purpose beyond simple neighborly assistance. When her father disappeared back into the barn, she seized the opportunity. "Why are you really here, Mr. Ryder?" she asked directly. He considered her for a long moment. "Your family's been good neighbors. That's reason enough." "We've barely exchanged 10 words in the 3 years you've owned your ranch," she countered. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Then perhaps it's time we remedied that, Miss Valentino." For the next several days, Jacob appeared at the farm each morning, working alongside her father on various repairs that suddenly seemed urgent. Daisy found herself watching him from the kitchen window as she helped her mother with household tasks, noting the easy way he worked, the respect with which he treated her father. On the 4th day, she brought coffee to the men as they worked on rebuilding a section of fence damaged in the storm. "Much obliged," Jacob said, taking the cup from her hands. Their fingers brushed, and Daisy felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the hot coffee. "Will you stay for supper, Mr. Ryder?" she heard herself asking, surprising both of them. He studied her face for a moment before answering. "I'd be honored, Miss Valentino." That evening marked a shift. Jacob sat at their table, his presence filling the small farmhouse kitchen in a way Daisy hadn't expected. He spoke with her father about cattle prices and railroad expansion, listened attentively to her mother's stories of pioneering days, and even drew shy Emily into conversation about the book she was reading. Not once did he mention the incident in town, though Daisy knew the gossip must have reached every corner of the county by now. As he prepared to leave, Daisy walked with him to the barn where his horse waited. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for supper, but for everything else." He turned to face her, his expression serious in the lantern light. "Daisy," he said, using her given name for the first time, "I need to be honest with you." Her heart stuttered. "About what?" "I knew Thomas Hoffman before he came to Willow Creek, back in Colorado Territory." His voice was low, measured. "He's not the man he pretends to be. What he did to you, it's a pattern. He's done it before." Daisy felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "How do you know this?" "My sister," Jacob said, a muscle tightening in his jaw. "She was engaged to him 3 years ago. He left her standing at the altar after spreading rumors that ruined her reputation in our hometown." "Your sister?" Daisy whispered, the pieces suddenly falling into place. "Is that why you helped me that day in town?" He shook his head. "I helped you because it was the right thing to do. But yes, when I saw what was happening, I recognized his tactics immediately. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Would you have believed me?" he asked quietly. "Or would you have thought I was just trying to malign the man you were engaged to?" She had no answer for that. In the weeks before Thomas had broken their engagement, she had been blinded by his charm and promises, deaf to the warnings of those who sensed something false beneath his polished exterior. "What happened to your sister?" she finally asked. "She left Colorado, started over in San Francisco." His expression softened slightly. "She's happy now, married to a good man who knows her worth." Daisy absorbed this information, feeling both betrayed by Thomas all over again and oddly comforted by Jacob's revelation. And you came to Wyoming to... what? Pursue him? I came for a fresh start myself. Finding him here was unexpected. Jacob secured his saddle. I didn't come tonight to upset you, Daisy. I just thought you deserved to know the truth. I appreciate that, she said, and meant it. Will you come tomorrow? For supper again? He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his face. I'd like that very much. Over the following weeks, Jacob became a regular visitor at the Valentino farm. He brought books for Emily, seed packets for Daisy's mother's garden, and an easy companionship that slowly mended something broken inside Daisy. On a warm June evening, he asked her to ride with him to see a hidden valley on his property. Her father gave his permission with a knowing look that made Daisy blush. They rode side by side, Jacob pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his time as a cavalry scout. The valley, when they reached it, took Daisy's breath away, a secluded paradise of wildflowers and cottonwoods, with a clear stream cutting through its heart. It's beautiful, she said, as they sat beneath a tree, watching the play of light on water. I come here to think, Jacob admitted. It reminds me that there's beauty in this harsh land, if you know where to look. She turned to find him watching her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. Jacob, why did you really help me that day? He was quiet for a long moment. Because I couldn't stand by and watch another good woman be destroyed by a man like Thomas Hoffman. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. And because from the moment I first saw you tending your garden last spring, I haven't been able to get you out of my mind. The confession hung between them, honest and unadorned. Daisy felt something unfurl within her chest, not the giddy excitement she'd felt with Thomas, but something deeper, more substantial. I was afraid, she admitted. After what happened, I thought no respectable man would ever look at me again. I'm looking, he said simply, and all I see is a woman of extraordinary courage and grace. When he kissed her, it was gentle and unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. Daisy felt the last of her doubts dissolve under the warmth of his touch. They returned to the farm as the sun was setting, both changed in ways neither could fully articulate. At the fence line, Jacob paused. Would you allow me to call on you properly, Daisy Valentino? She smiled, feeling truly light-hearted for the first time in months. I would like that very much, Jacob Ryder. His courtship was deliberate and traditional. He brought small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, wildflowers gathered on his morning ride, a book of poetry she'd mentioned wanting to read. They took Sunday afternoon walks under the watchful eye of Emily, who trailed behind them, nose buried in her own book, but never quite out of sight. In town, Daisy held her head high, as whispers followed them down the street. Jacob's steady presence beside her made the gossip easier to bear, though it didn't stop entirely. They're saying I trapped you, she told him one afternoon, as they walked back from church. That I set my cap for you, after Thomas discarded me. Jacob's laugh was unexpected. Let them talk. We know the truth. And what is the truth? She asked, suddenly needing to hear him say it. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The truth is that I'm in love with you, Daisy Valentino. I have been for longer than I care to admit. Even to myself. Joy bloomed within her like the wildflowers after spring rain. I love you too, she whispered, the words feeling right and true as they left her lips. In August, Jacob asked her father for permission to marry her. The wedding was set for October, after the harvest was in. The night before their wedding, Daisy sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Jacob Ryder. The thought filled her with both excitement and a quiet certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, held in the small church in Willow Creek. Daisy wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her taller frame. Jacob couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. You are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, he whispered as she reached him. Not everyone in town attended. Thomas Hoffman and his family were conspicuously absent, as were several families who had been most vocal in their condemnation of Daisy. But those who came celebrated with genuine happiness for the couple. That night, in the privacy of the bedroom in Jacob's ranch house, now their home, he loved her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. His hands and lips mapped her body with reverent care, and when they finally came together as husband and wife, Daisy felt as though she'd found a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing. "Mine," he whispered against her skin as they lay tangled together afterward, "and I am yours, completely." Life settled into a rhythm of hard work and quiet joy. Jacob expanded his cattle operation, while Daisy transformed the ranch house into a true home. They hosted her family for Sunday dinners, rode together in the evenings, and shared their hopes and dreams in the intimate darkness of their bedroom. 3 months after their wedding, Daisy realized she was with child. When she told Jacob, his face lit with such wonder that she felt her heart might burst from happiness. "A baby," he said in awe, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." As her body changed, Jacob's devotion only deepened. He insisted on her resting more, hired a woman from town to help with household chores, and spent evenings reading aloud to her as she sewed tiny garments for their coming child. The gossip in town took a new turn. "Awful quick, that baby," Daisy overheard one woman remark to another as she selected fabric in the general store. "Makes you wonder if she wasn't already in trouble when poor Jacob Ryder married her." Daisy's hand instinctively went to her growing belly, protected beneath her loose dress. 7 months married, 5 months with child, the timing would raise eyebrows among those inclined to count. That evening, she confided her fears to Jacob. "They're saying I trapped you with a child that might not be yours." His reaction surprised her. Instead of anger, he laughed, gathering her close against him. "Let them talk," he said, echoing words he'd said before. "This child is ours, made from our love. Nothing else matters. But your reputation is exactly as I want it to be, a man madly in love with his wife, eagerly awaiting their first child." He kissed her softly. "Besides, anyone who can count will realize this baby is coming right on time for a couple who couldn't keep their hands off each other from their wedding night." His words made her blush and laugh at the same time, the weight lifting from her shoulders. Spring brought new calves to the ranch, an advancing discomfort to Daisy as her time grew near. Jacob rarely left her side, delegating ranch work to his hired hands whenever possible. On a stormy night in May, Daisy went into labor. The midwife was summoned from town, and Jacob was banished to the parlor, where he paced the floor like a caged mountain lion, wincing at each cry that echoed through the house. After 14 hours, the midwife placed a red-faced, squalling infant in Daisy's exhausted arms. "You have a daughter, Mrs. Ryder," she announced, "strong and perfect." When Jacob was finally allowed into the bedroom, the sight of Daisy cradling their tiny daughter stopped him in his tracks. He approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid they might disappear if he moved too quickly. "Meet your daughter," Daisy said softly, lifting the bundle slightly. Jacob sat beside them, one finger gently tracing the baby's perfect cheek. "She's beautiful," he whispered, voice thick with emotion, "just like her mother." They named her Grace Elizabeth Ryder, and from her first day she was the center of their world. Jacob proved to be a devoted father, as comfortable cradling his daughter as he was handling the wildest bronco on the ranch. When Grace was 3 months old, Daisy ventured into town with her for the first time. She'd expected the usual whispers and sidelong glances, but instead found herself surrounded by women eager to admire the baby. "She has your eyes, Daisy," Mrs. Peterson from the millinery shop commented. "And her father's chin, for certain," added the preacher's wife. The warmth of their acceptance was unexpected and healing. As Daisy made her way through town, completing her errands with Grace nestled against her chest in a sling, she realized that something had shifted. Perhaps it was simply time, or the undeniable evidence of her happy marriage, or the fact that new scandals had replaced the old. She was crossing the street toward the general store when a familiar figure emerged, Thomas Hoffman, looking considerably less prosperous than when she'd last seen him. Rumor had it that his father had lost heavily in bad investments, and the family's standing in town had diminished accordingly. Their eyes met briefly across the dusty street. Daisy felt a momentary tightening in her chest, memories of humiliation threatening to surface. But as Grace made a small sound against her, Daisy looked down at her daughter's peaceful face, and the moment passed. When she looked up again, Thomas had turned away, hurrying toward the bank without acknowledgement. Daisy continued on her way, suddenly understanding what Jacob had meant about the truth making itself known in time. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Grace sleeping contentedly in her father's arms, Daisy told Jacob about the encounter. "And how did it make you feel?" he asked, his gaze steady on her face. Daisy considered the question carefully. "Free," she finally said. "I felt free, as if the last chain connecting me to that time had finally broken." He smiled, leaning over to kiss her softly. "You've been free all along, my love. You just needed to realize it." Grace grew from a baby to a toddler, her determined personality evident from her first steps. Jacob doted on her shamelessly, teaching her to ride almost before she could walk properly. Their days were filled with the rhythms of ranch life, cattle drives, harvest time, winter preparations, spring renewal. When Grace was 2, Daisy discovered she was expecting their second child. The news delighted Jacob, who immediately began planning expansions to the house. "Another girl, do you think?" he asked one night as they lay together, his hand resting on the slight swell of her abdomen. "Perhaps a boy this time," Daisy replied, smiling at the thought. "A little cowboy with his father's eyes." The pregnancy progressed without complications until her 7th month, when Daisy woke one night with sharp pains. The doctor was summoned, and after a tense examination, prescribed complete bed rest. "The baby is in danger of coming too early," he explained grimly. "You must stay off your feet, Mrs. Ryder, if you want to give your child a fighting chance." The weeks that followed tested Daisy's patience and Jacob's resourcefulness. He hired additional help for the house, arranged for her mother to stay with them to care for Grace, and spent every spare moment at Daisy's bedside, reading to her or simply holding her hand. "I'm sorry," she said one afternoon, frustrated by her confinement and worried about the strain on him. "You didn't bargain for an invalid wife." Jacob's expression was fierce as he took her hands in his. "I bargained for you, Daisy Ryder, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. This is just a difficult season, not our whole story." His unwavering support carried her through the long days of waiting. Finally, in the early hours of a cold February morning, their son was born small but healthy, with a robust cry that echoed through the ranch house. "James William Ryder," Jacob announced proudly to the ranch hands who had anxiously awaited news. Mother and son are doing well. As spring returned to the Wyoming territory, Daisy sat on the porch rocker, nursing baby James while watching Jacob teach Grace how to guide a gentle pony around the corral. The sight of them together, her tall, strong husband patiently walking beside their fearless daughter, filled her with contentment. 5 years had passed since that terrible day in Willow Creek when she thought her life was over. 5 years that had brought her more joy than she could have imagined possible. The sound of an approaching wagon drew her attention. Her parents and sister were coming up the drive for their weekly Sunday dinner. Emily, now 17 and as beautiful as she was bookish, waved excitedly from the wagon seat. "Look who we found on the road," her father called as they drew closer. Behind the wagon rode a young man Daisy recognized as Matthew Cooper, the new school teacher who had recently arrived in Willow Creek. The way he looked at Emily made Daisy smile knowingly. Jacob came to stand beside her as the visitors approached, little Grace running ahead to greet her grandparents. "Another suitor for Emily?" he murmured, his hand resting comfortably on Daisy's shoulder. "It appears so," she replied, leaning into his touch. "Mother says he's been finding reasons to visit the farm almost daily." Jacob chuckled, history repeating itself. "Not quite," Daisy said, looking up at him with a smile. "No scandal this time, just a straightforward courtship." He bent to kiss her lightly. "Sometimes the scenic route leads to the most beautiful destinations." James stirred against her breast, his tiny hand clutching at the fabric of her dress. Daisy adjusted him carefully, marveling as she always did at the perfection of his small features. "I wouldn't change a thing," she said softly. "Not even the painful parts. They led me here, to you and our children." Jacob's expression softened as he gazed at his wife and son. "They claimed you were ruined," he said, his voice low and intense. "But I knew better from the start. You were never ruined, Daisy. You were waiting for this life, for our family, for me." The words wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. "And you found me," she whispered. "I found you," he agreed, and called you mine. As their family and guests gathered around them, filling the ranch house with laughter and conversation, Daisy felt the fullness of her blessings. The woman they had once claimed was ruined forever had found her true beginning in the arms of a cowboy who had seen her worth when others could not. Together, they had built something that would endure long after the whispers had faded to nothing, a love as vast and enduring as the Wyoming sky above them. The years passed, marking their lives with the milestones that shape a family's history. Grace grew into a spirited young woman with her mother's beauty and her father's determination. James, sturdy and thoughtful, showed an early aptitude for ranching that delighted Jacob. When Daisy gave birth to their third child, another daughter they named Margaret Rose, Jacob expanded the ranch house again, adding a nursery with windows that caught the morning sun. Their home became a gathering place for neighbors and friends, known for its warmth and hospitality. Thomas Hoffman eventually left Willow Creek after his father's bank failed completely. The last Daisy heard, he had headed to California, still unmarried and chasing elusive fortunes. She found she could think of him now without bitterness, grateful for the path that had led her to Jacob instead. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jacob surprised Daisy with a trip to San Francisco to visit his sister, Emma. The children stayed with Daisy's parents, thrilled at the prospect of 2 weeks of grandparental indulgence. San Francisco dazzled Daisy with its bustling streets and elegant buildings. Emma, who had indeed found happiness with her merchant husband, welcomed them warmly into her beautiful home, overlooking the bay. "I never properly thanked you," Emma said to Daisy one afternoon as they watched ships entering the harbor, "for healing my brother's heart." Daisy looked at her in surprise. "I think it was he who healed mine." Emma smiled. "Perhaps you healed each other. After what happened with Thomas, Jacob was so angry, so determined never to trust again. When his letters started mentioning you, I knew something had changed in him." That night, in the privacy of their guest room, Daisy shared Emma's words with Jacob as they lay together, the sounds of the city a distant backdrop to their intimacy. "Was she right?" Daisy asked, tracing the familiar contours of his face in the moonlight. "Were you determined never to trust again?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, his fingers playing with a strand of her hair. "I was cautious," he admitted. "After seeing what Thomas did to Emma, I was wary of all fine-talking men and the women who fell for them. And yet you married me, even knowing I had fallen for his lies. I married you because you showed me that a broken heart can mend stronger than before." He pulled her closer. "You faced the town's judgment with such courage. How could I not fall in love with that kind of strength?" Daisy kissed him then, pouring a decade of love into the gesture. 10 years, she murmured against his lips, "and I love you more today than I did on our wedding day." "As I love you," he replied, his hands beginning the familiar journey across her body, retracing paths of pleasure they had discovered together. Later, as Jacob slept beside her, Daisy stood at the window, looking out at the unfamiliar city. So different from their Wyoming home, yet in the most important ways, it felt the same. She was with Jacob, secure in his love and the life they had built together. When they returned to the ranch, Daisy found herself appreciating anew the beauty of their home, the mountains rising in the distance, the cattle grazing on rolling grasslands, the garden she had cultivated year after year. All of it seemed more precious after her glimpse of city life. The children greeted them with exuberant hugs and a torrent of stories about their adventures with Grandma and Grandpa. Grace, now 9, had apparently spent most of her time on horseback. 7-year-old James had helped Grandpa repair fences and even delivered a calf with minimal assistance. Little Margaret, not quite 3, had learned several new words and developed a concerning talent for finding mischief. Life resumed its familiar rhythms, but with a renewed appreciation that Daisy carried within her. Each morning, as she watched Jacob ride out to check the herd, each evening as they gathered around the dinner table with their children, each night as they retired to their bedroom, she gave silent thanks for the unexpected turns that had brought her to this life. In town, Daisy was now greeted with respect and genuine warmth. The scandal that had once threatened to define her was largely forgotten, replaced by her reputation as a loving mother, capable rancher's wife, and generous neighbor. Mrs. Ryder, the new minister's wife, approached her after church one Sunday. Would you consider joining our committee to establish a proper school building? We're in desperate need of a woman with your organizational abilities." The invitation, one of many community engagements now extended to her, would have been unthinkable in those dark days after Thomas's public rejection. Daisy accepted with a smile, catching Jacob's proud glance from where he stood with James. That autumn brought challenges when an early blizzard threatened the cattle. Jacob and his men worked day and night to bring the herd to sheltered areas, returning to the house exhausted and half frozen. "We lost 20 head, Jacob reported grimly after the worst had passed. Could have been much worse if the men hadn't worked so hard. Daisy listened as he described their efforts, hearing the weight of responsibility in his voice. That night, she massaged the knots from his shoulders and reminded him of the many successful years they'd had. "One bad season doesn't define us," she said, echoing words he had once spoken to her. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "When did my wife become so wise?" "I had an excellent teacher," she replied with a smile. As their children grew, so did the ranch. Jacob's careful management and forward-thinking investments expanded their holdings until Ryder Ranch became one of the most prosperous in the territory. When Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, they celebrated with neighbors and friends, marveling at how much had changed since they'd first come to this wild land. Grace, at 16, was the image of Daisy at that age, though with a confidence her mother had developed only later in life. James, 14 and nearly as tall as his father, had inherited Jacob's quiet competence and steady nature. Margaret, 10 years old and bright as a new penny, kept them all on their toes with her quick mind and endless questions. "She should go to college," Jacob said one evening, as they watched Margaret poring over a book far beyond her years. "All of them should have that opportunity, if they want it." Daisy looked at him in surprise. Few ranchers in Wyoming considered higher education necessary, especially for their daughters. "You would send Grace to college, even if it meant her leaving the ranch?" Jacob nodded thoughtfully. "The world is changing, Daisy. Our daughters will need more than we did to make their way in it." His progressive thinking was one of the many reasons she loved him. While other men of their acquaintance still viewed their daughters primarily as future wives and mothers, Jacob saw Grace and Margaret as individuals with their own paths to forge. That winter, tragedy struck when Jacob's sister Emma and her husband perished in a fire that consumed their San Francisco home. The news reached them by telegram, the stark words devastating in their brevity. Jacob's grief was profound. He had always been a man of few words, but in the days following the news, he retreated further into silence, spending long hours alone on horseback or sitting in his study with the door closed. Daisy gave him space while ensuring he knew she was there whenever he needed her. At night, she would often find him standing at the window, looking out at the stars as if searching for answers in their distant light. "I should have visited more often," he said one night, breaking a silence that had stretched for hours. "We always thought there would be more time." Daisy moved to stand beside him, slipping her arm around his waist. "She knew you loved her, Jacob. Distance doesn't change that. She was the only family I had left after our parents died." His voice was rough with emotion. "Now there's just me." "No," Daisy said firmly, turning him to face her. "Not just you. Us, me and the children. We are your family too." Something in her words seemed to reach him. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could scarcely breathe. "What would I do without you, Daisy Ryder?" "You'll never have to find out," she promised, her words muffled against his chest. Spring brought renewal to the land and healing to their home. Jacob slowly emerged from his grief, finding comfort in the daily work of the ranches and the love of his family. When Emma's will revealed that she had left her considerable assets to her brother, Jacob decided to use the inheritance to establish a foundation that would provide educational opportunities for young women in Wyoming territory. "Emma always valued learning," he explained to Daisy. "This feels like the right way to honor her memory." The Emma Ryder Foundation would go on to help dozens of young women, including their own daughters, pursue education that might otherwise have been beyond their reach. As Grace's 18th birthday approached, Daisy found herself reflecting on how different her daughter's life was from her own at that age. Grace had never known the kind of scandal that had once threatened to define Daisy's future. She moved through the world with a confidence born of knowing herself valued and loved. You and Father have been married for nearly 20 years, Grace remarked one afternoon as they worked together in the garden. How did you know he was the right one? Daisy smiled, remembering the early days of her relationship with Jacob. He saw me clearly, she said after a moment. Not as others wanted me to be, or feared I might be, but exactly as I was, and he loved what he saw. Grace considered this, her expression thoughtful. Like David Cooper sees me? The mention of the young rancher who had been calling on Grace with increasing frequency made Daisy's heart skip a beat. David was Matthew and Emily's eldest son, Daisy's own nephew, making him Grace's first cousin. The young man had grown up on a neighboring ranch, and though the families had always been close, the nature of his interest in Grace had clearly shifted in recent months. Is there something you want to tell me about David? Daisy asked carefully. Grace blushed, the pink in her cheeks matching the rose she was tending. He asked Father's permission to court me officially. Last Sunday after church. And what did your father say? He said he needed to discuss it with you first. Grace looked up anxiously. You don't disapprove, do you? Because we're cousins? Daisy considered her response carefully. First cousin marriages were not uncommon in the West, where eligible partners could be scarce, but they did raise eyebrows in some circles. I want you to be happy, she said finally. And David is a fine young man. If your father approves and you're sure of your feelings, then I won't stand in your way. Grace's smile was radiant. Thank you, Mother. I do love him, you know. I think I always have, in some way. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Daisy discussed the matter with Jacob as they sat together on the porch, enjoying the cool night air. David Cooper, Jacob mused, rolling the name on his tongue as if testing its weight. Good with horses, works hard, respectful. And our nephew, Daisy added, watching his face. Jacob nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that. The blood connection is distant enough Emily and you aren't related by blood, only by marriage. So you don't object? If Grace loves him, and he loves her, he shrugged. Life is too short to stand in the way of happiness. I told David he could call on her properly, with your approval. Daisy leaned against him, grateful once again for his practical wisdom. Our daughter, courting. Where did the years go, Jacob? He chuckled, his arm tightening around her shoulders. They're right here in the lines on my face and the silver in your hair, Mrs. Ryder. Evidence of a life well lived. As predicted, David began calling on Grace regularly. His intentions were honorable, his manner respectful, and his affection for Grace evident in every glance. By Christmas, an engagement was announced with a wedding planned for the following spring. The preparations consumed the household. Daisy and Grace worked together on the wedding dress, adapting the gown Daisy had worn to marry Jacob with new lace and delicate embroidery. Jacob expanded the ranch's operations, bringing David in as a partner and building a small house for the young couple on Ryder land. Not too close, he told Daisy with a wink, but not so far that we can't see our grandchildren regularly. The idea of grandchildren, a new generation of Ryders and Coopers, filled Daisy with a bittersweet joy. Her children were growing up, moving toward lives of their own, while she and Jacob entered a new phase of their journey together. On the morning of Grace's wedding, Daisy helped her daughter dress, fighting back tears as she secured the final buttons on the wedding gown. You look beautiful, she whispered, stepping back to admire the young woman before her. Absolutely beautiful. Grace turned from the mirror, her eyes bright with emotion. Mother, I'm nervous. That's natural, sweetheart. Were you? Nervous, I mean, on your wedding day? Daisy smiled at the memory. Terrified, and happier than I'd ever been. What if... Grace hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. What if I'm not enough? What if I disappoint him? The vulnerability in her daughter's eyes transported Daisy back to her own youth, to the fears that had plagued her after Thomas's rejection, and before Jacob's love had shown her the truth of her own worth. Grace Elizabeth Ryder, she said firmly, taking her daughter's hands. You are more than enough. You always have been. David knows how fortunate he is to win your heart. Never doubt that. Grace's smile trembled, then steadied. I love him so much, Mother. The way you love Father. Then you're very lucky indeed, Daisy replied, kissing her daughter's cheek. Now, let's not keep your groom waiting any longer. The wedding was everything they had hoped for. a joyful celebration that brought together friends and neighbors from across the county. Jacob, resplendent in his best suit, fought back tears as he walked his daughter down the aisle. James stood proudly as David's best man, while Margaret served as her sister's maid of honor, solemn with the responsibility. As David and Grace exchanged their vows, Daisy found herself watching Jacob instead of the bride and groom. The years had added dignity to his features, silver to his temples, and depth to the love that shone in his eyes when he caught her gaze across the church. At the reception, held at Ryder Ranch under tents set up in the sprawling front yard, Jacob claimed Daisy for a dance, holding her close as they moved to the music. "Happy, Mrs. Ryder?" he murmured against her ear. "Completely," she replied, leaning into his familiar embrace. "Our daughter is married to a good man, our son is becoming a fine rancher, and Margaret will likely be running the territory before she's 20. Jacob laughed, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her cheek. "And what about you? What does Daisy Ryder want for herself, now that her children are growing up?" The question caught her by surprise. For so long, her identity had been wrapped up in being Jacob's wife and their children's mother. The idea of wanting something just for herself seemed almost foreign. She began, then stopped, considering. "I want to learn to paint, really paint, not just sketch. I want to capture this land, our home, our life together." Jacob looked down at her, his expression tender. "Then that's what you'll do. I'll ride into Cheyenne next week and bring back everything you need." "Just like that?" "Just like that." He twirled her gently, his movements still graceful, despite the arthritis that sometimes troubled his left knee. "You've given me 3 beautiful children and more happiness than any man deserves. The least I can do is buy you some paint." As the celebration continued around them, Daisy rested her head against Jacob's shoulder, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought them to this moment. From scandal and heartbreak to a love that had withstood every test, from being the woman they claimed was ruined forever to the matriarch of a thriving family. Hers was a story of redemption and second chances. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for all she felt. Jacob seemed to understand, as he always did. "For what, my love? For seeing me, for calling me yours, for everything that followed." His arms tightened around her. "Best decision I ever made," he said simply. As the years continued to pass, their family grew with the addition of grandchildren, first Grace and David's twins, a boy and girl who inherited their grandmother's green eyes, then James's 3 children with his wife Sarah, a schoolteacher from Denver who had captured his heart during a cattle drive. Margaret, true to her independent nature, pursued higher education at a women's college in the East, supported by the Emma Ryder Foundation. Her letters home were filled with excitement about new ideas and possibilities, though she always ended with assurances that Wyoming remained her true home. Jacob and Daisy settled into the rhythms of their later years, with the same companionable ease that had marked their marriage from the beginning. Jacob gradually turned over more of the ranch operations to James and David, though he remained actively involved in major decisions. Daisy discovered a genuine talent for painting, her landscapes and portraits of ranch life eventually finding admirers beyond their immediate circle. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children surprised them with a party that brought together friends from throughout their life together. Some guests traveled from as far as California and New York to celebrate the couple whose love story had inspired many. To Jacob and Daisy, James proposed a toast, raising his glass high. "Who taught us that true love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about seeing someone perfectly." As glasses clinked and congratulations echoed around them, Jacob leaned close to Daisy. "Still happy with your choice, Mrs. Ryder?" he asked, the familiar question a ritual between them. "Always," she replied, her hand finding his under the table. "From the moment you helped me onto your horse that day in town, there was never really any other choice to make." Later that night, as they stood together on the porch of the home they had built over 3 decades, Jacob pulled Daisy into his arms, his embrace still strong despite his 63 years. "They claimed you were ruined," he murmured against her hair, silver now where it had once been gold. "But all I ever saw was the woman who would complete me." Daisy smiled up at him, the lines around her eyes deepening with happiness. "And you called me yours." "I did," he agreed, his voice tender with memory. And you gave me everything your heart, our children, a life beyond anything I could have imagined. Under the vast Wyoming sky, scattered with stars that had witnessed their entire journey together, they shared a kiss as sweet and true as their first. Two people who had found in each other not just love, but home, the greatest gift of all, in a wild and uncertain world. And in that moment, as in all the moments that had come before and all those yet to come, they were exactly where they were meant to be, together.